Hello, friends, and welcome. I'm Lauren from Beltline to Broadway. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm going to try to, I'm really bad at saying that. And so I'm going to try to normalize it. Yesterday was pronouns day. Now is as good a time as any. And I am here with Dr. Alisa Hurwitz, also known as Dr. Drama. And I'm just so happy to hang out with you. I was so happy to meet you in New York.
It was such a treat to get to see you in person in 3 dimensions and get to hang out.
IRL in real life, as the kids would say. We're going to be talking about transgender representation on stage. I am going to preface this whole conversation by saying there is so much to unpack with this topic. This is the first of 2 conversations I'm going to be hosting. I will tell you about the second one at the end of this broadcast. But we're just going to scratch the surface. And if it gets you thinking and talking and reflecting, then that's the goal. But there's a lot here.
Yeah. Yes. I think it's a good caveat that there's no way that we're going to cover it. It's complex, because humanity is complex and issues are complex. Nothing's black and white. And also, in full disclosure, we're having this conversation as two people who identify as being cisgender. So, like my expertise, it comes from professional knowledge and focus. I in my clinical practice have a focus in working with the trans community in my area. Excuse me. But I don't have the lived experience, and so that puts a particular limitation on our conversation. And not that we shouldn't have it. I speak up about trans rights and trans representation as an act of solidarity with our trans siblings, but we did reach out to a few people who were both employed, so they were otherwise occupied, which was wonderful. But just acknowledging that that as cis folks, that it limits. We don't have the lived experience and lived expertise.
We do not. And I will say my next conversation that we're going to have on this in November is with Candace Cox, who's an LGBTQ advocate. She has been brought in as a consultant for local folks who are familiar with Raleigh Little Theater's production of Cinderella. That production has always been done in panto spirit, and for the last decades and decades, however long it's been, the stepsisters have been played by men. This year, that is going to change. I did bring in a consultant to discuss LGBTQ representation, and she will be with me November 2nd to talk about Cinderella and the choices that they've made. And so this, like I said, ongoing conversation. But for today, we'll just gloss the surface and speak as allies and friends of the trans community. And the reason I wanted to have this conversation this week is because the Tootsie National Tour just launched. As we speak, Tootsie is playing up the street at the Durham Performing Arts Center. I saw it the other night. And Doubtfire on Broadway is opening. Jagged Little Pill is reopening tonight, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. And I don't think that neither Alisa or I are here to tell you what to like and what not to like. I'm not here to tell you to ban Tootsie or not go see it. I'm not here to say that. But what I would like you to think about when you take in any form of media, whether it's on stage or on screen, is to be mindful that there are a lot of people in the trans community hurting right now. 2020 was the most violent year on record for transgender and gender nonconforming people. In 2020, 44 fatalities were tracked by the Human Rights Campaign. And so far in 2021, we've had at least 41 transgender and gender nonconforming people who have been fatally shot or killed by violent means. So I guess my first question for you, Alisa, is there a place for shows like Tootsie and Doubtfire on stage now? Or do these narratives kind of perpetuate this culture of misinformation or trans misogyny?
Yeah, it's a great question. In informing myself about, about these shows, and again, full disclosure, I haven't seen Mrs. Doubtfire or Tootsie. But my understanding from reading about people who are trans, who have seen those shows, and reading, critical discourse about those shows and about the trope of the man in the dress, right, which goes back to the production of Cinderella you were talking about. The link is that there is such people don't understand this topic of gender identity. Just fundamentally don't understand. It's not something that we talk about in our culture. In a similar way that we didn't talk about sexual identity, a few decades up until a couple decades ago. It's just part of like development. So most people have never explored it, so they don't understand even what it means. They don't understand the difference between sex and gender identity, or gender identity and gender and gender norms and gender expression. So this trope of the man in the dress plays into this common misconception that that's what a trans woman is. My understanding from people who have seen Mrs. Doubtfire is that the process that they've tried to run through the show, the creative team, and getting a consultant on after people spoke out about, playing up on that trope, is that it is possible to have a character who is doing drag, in essence, without them being in a dress, and them being a man in a dress being the joke. That's where a lot of the harm comes from, is that it's funny that a man's in a dress.
That is the problem with Tootsie. That's the problem with Tootsie, is that is the whole joke. That's the whole crux of the joke.
And this misunderstanding even of misogyny, and that, like, the narrative in that story is in the Broadway show, as I understand it, is that the main character ultimately has an easier time getting a job as a woman than as a man, which is like laughable. it's nothing's easier because you're a woman. Like, it's naive. And most shows are, creative teams are men, white, cisgender, able-bodied males. So, men misunderstanding the impact of that narrative, cisgender men misunderstanding the impact of that narrative, is, it clocks, right? And that's why we need more representation behind the stage as well, so that different perspectives are being represented. I think about a show like, this is a little kind of off to the side, but a show like Dana H. and This Is a Room, and they're both getting rave reviews, which is great. I mean, they sound wonderful, but it's also written by a man. Like, a play's written by, was written or directed by men. And it's like, it's interesting that you're telling these stories about, like, in one case, like a woman being sexually assaulted,
Mm.
through the male lens.
Yeah. Well, and that's a whole other
Yeah. Sorry. Yeah. Can of worms.
conversation. That's a whole other conversation.
Yeah.
Um, but I do think that it's really important for people to be mindful and respectful. And if they're going to produce this kind of work to bring into consultants, I will say in Tootsie, I did not see it on Broadway, so I don't really know the changes that they made, but there are several um, side characters in Tootsie who become kind of the conscience or the voice and express concerns for what
Hmm.
is happening on stage. And so I'm supposing that is how they've addressed the issue.
Hmm.
Um, I'm curious because I mentioned the panto tradition, and panto goes back centuries to English tradition where men dressed as women and were the joke. And there's panto productions. Lithgow Family Productions was trying to bring panto here to the United States in the last few years, and we had several fairy tale productions, including Snow White, that were on stage here for kids. Has it ever been okay for a man to
Hmm.
dress as a woman on stage? And if
Hmm.
so, when did it stop being okay?
Yes, and this is where I think it gets really complicated, or the whole thing is complicated, right? It's complex. There is not a yes. There's not a. It. It's not black or white. So I'm
Right.
not a theater historian, so correct me if I'm wrong. But you said 13th century. It's as old as 13th century.
It's centuries and centuries. I don't know
Centuries,
when it
right?
goes back to, but it
Right. So
goes back.
humor goes back. Humor always comes from the unexpected. And so I would conjecture that the unexpected there is breaking, gender norms, like very, very distinctly breaking gender norms, from centuries ago. They were even, more strict than they are now. And so if that's the crux of the humor, then can panto ever not be couched in transmisogyny? Excuse me. Whereas we think about a different art form of a man in a dress, of drag, that came out of gender expression, transgressive protest, pol, you know, pol, political art, and in celebration of women. And so a man can be in a dress and it has a totally different tone, totally different meaning, totally different impact. The joke isn't that a man's wearing a dress. Um, the jokes are something totally different. Uh, the beauty is that a man is wearing a dress. That's the beauty, and that celebration, um, ha, like I said a minute ago, has a totally different impact than something like panto. Um, but then you get into other complicated areas like Shakespeare, right, where traditionally it was performed, only by men. What does that mean? And how do we take that? Is that because women just weren't allowed on stage, and how does that translate to what that what that means? Or you have like a gender swap role. I don't like that term because it's problematic for a variety of reasons. It's not like it's either or, but that's the problem with
Right.
it. But um I think about oh gosh, I'm totally blanking on her name. She was in Les Mis and she won a Oscar for it.
Anne Hathaway?
Thank you. Yes, that's the one. And Hathaway in Shakespeare in the Park, the character is a woman playing a man, and what that means. So I'm just using that as an example of like it's complicated, but when you compare panto and drag, there's there. I think you can really see how the intention and the tradition change the tone and the impact.
And I love that you're making this distinction. And I would direct people towards the Amazon film adaptation of Everybody's Talking About Jamie, because there is such beautiful discourse in there.
Mm,
There's just a beautiful moment in there where they really do acknowledge the history of drag culture. And it just was so moving to me. So I would direct people to that movie, because I do think that speaks to exactly what you're talking about,
yes.
as far as the distinction.
I
Um,
would also recommend, there's an HBO series called We're Here,
mm,
a shortened version of We're Here and We're Queer, which has been, a rallying cry in the gay community. And it's got three well-known drag queens from the RuPaul drag race world, going into the middle of the country using drag as teaching people how to do a drag performance as a way to make some kind of change. So from this political, from the political history of the art form, and it is truly one of the best shows in recent years. It's so powerful, and it shows you how. Yeah, I mean, it just shows what drag can do.
and as we go through this, and hopefully we'll give people some resources, and I will list, when I repost this later, I will list all these resources for you with links so that you can access these things really easily.
Right.
Um, this show, Jagged Little Pill, um, reopens tonight.
Mm,
Um, I know there are some, or at least from what I heard, there were some planned protests around it. And the show really came under fire because of the way one of the characters in that show is portrayed, the character of Joe. During the out of town tryout, Joe was portrayed as a non binary character. But when they moved it to Broadway, that changed. Joe became cisgender gay female. Um, Lauren Patton, who just won the Tony Award, she is a cisgender female. And to kind of address a lot of these issues, Jagged Little Pill produced a 4-part video discussion series called Wake Up, Why Social Responsibility in Theater Matters. During one of those episodes, they addressed gender expression and sexuality. But there's a lot of people still um, upset over Jagged Little Pill. Um, did the show go far enough in addressing these issues?
huh, also complicated. Um, I think so. When it was out of town, when it was at the American Repertory Theater, there was discussion around the show about that. Okay, this character seems to be going, figuring out that they are non-binary. We have who we think is a cis actor playing the role. Is that appropriate? I think they made, some the changes to the character somewhat in response to that, and somewhat just in response to like streamlining the narrative and the show, which shows do. But then it felt like erasure. So then they said in that series that character was never anything but cisgender in Boston, and that was the gaslighting that people refer to, because people know what they saw. Um, so the show has caused real harm. The show also has done it was the first show on Broadway to have every actor's pronouns listed in their bio. So,
Mm.
here's a show like taking risks and getting, I think, a lot of the heat that the whole industry deserves. So some of it is fair, and they acknowledge that. And some of it is just, the trans people have been just asking for equity, and screaming into the void. And finally it's like, the show's responding to those to those requests for equity, and they've stumbled. And so they're getting a lot of heat about that. Lauren, I think the other interesting thing that I'm not seeing really discussed is that so Jagged Little Pill put out a statement about, like an action plan, which I thought was great. People are upset that Lauren's staying in the role. But Lauren did a talk with Shakina, who's a trans activist and an actor in their own right, very much so. They talked about all of this. And I heard Lauren, what I took away from it is that Lauren was saying that she's questioning her gender identity, and she's not ready to talk about that publicly. I watched the thing from beginning to end. And so what if we find out down the road that she, for example, actually identifies as non-binary, and she's, as some part of the community, has been getting all of this vitriol while she's going through her own journey. I don't feel so good about that. I think it's such a gray area. What if she's just not ready to talk about it publicly? Is this representation still? And I don't think she deserves to be called transphobic. I don't begrudge anybody their feelings. People are upset, and that is valid. What you do with that upset can be better or worse. And I think attacking her, I don't think that's fair, and I don't think that moves the needle. People listen when we talk, not when we yell. Again, your people's feelings are so valid. That is valid.
And the emotions are so raw, and it's hard to. We ask so much of our performers and our actors, and sometimes forget that there are humans behind these characters. And those humans are, a lot of the cast of Jagged Little Pill, these are young people. A lot of them are making their Broadway debuts, and they are working things out, as young people do, as all people do. And so I'm very I get concerned about these attacks, especially attacks on social media platforms, especially this cancel culture that we're living in.
Yeah.
Because like you, I don't feel like it really moves the needle.
If somebody's unrepentant, I think it's okay to say, I am not going to support with my dollars and or attention their art or their whatever, their business. I think that's different than a show like Jagged Little Pill having her, or Lauren, having conversations, having these difficult conversations, and having an action plan, which they've already enacted, right? The other day they announced, I'm not here to defend, just to be clear, I'm not here to defend anyone or any show or anybody. I'm just, I see them trying to make change, and I don't see Tootsie trying to make change, right? So there's a comparison there, and I want change. I want change for our trans siblings, and so I want to highlight and encourage it. And even though it's not enough yet, it's movement, and that's good, right? So they had an action plan. They've already enacted it. They announced their Australian cast for the show, and as promised, the actor playing Joe is non-binary.
Yes,
that was on their action plan. So that's good. This is good.
Yes. Well, and I don't think change happens overnight, and I think we have to approach, as we look at these things and try to make sense of what we're seeing in our area, we also have to approach it with an ounce of grace, especially when a show like Jagged Little Pill is getting an action plan and making an effort. This is a big show. There's a lot of moving parts. There's a lot of people involved. Change isn't going to happen overnight, but I think important we acknowledge that. And I'm glad you mentioned the Australian touring cast. It features a queer actor, Maggie McKenna, as Jo. Um, and I
And
think
non-binary.
a non-binary.
Yeah, specifically.
And
Yeah.
yeah, so I think
Yeah. That's change.
I think
That's
it's
that's
change.
change.
Yes. Um, and going one step further, I think we have to acknowledge a person like Alexandra Billings, who is portraying Madame Morrible in the Broadway production of Wicked, has nothing to do with her being trans. It just has to do with her playing a fierce role, or with
Right.
them playing a fierce role on Broadway.
Right.
As Broadway begins to reopen and we have more and more of these conversations, do you think we're going to start to see this shift in the stories we see on stage? And what's so notable Alexandra Billings in that role is that comes after Cameron McIntosh made some terrible comments about casting trans people in roles like that, as being gimmicky. But are we going
Right.
to start to see a rising up and a cultural shift, and companies being more mindful about casting choices, casting decisions, action plans like we're talking about?
I think so. I think, we're at a reckoning, right? We've been in this reckoning in theater industry over the past couple of years, in terms of racism as well, and to a certain degree misogyny. And it all needs to happen. I suspect, I don't know, I'm curious what you think. I suspect we're going to see changes in casting more diversely in terms of gender identity before we see more diverse stories being told. I think, it's kind of as you go up the power ladder, and producers, selecting shows to produce, is kind of the pretty much at the top of the chain, and I'm not sure we're going to see that as quickly. We're already seeing some change. We're already seeing shows hiring, like, hiring natural hair consultants, for example,
Yes.
because of the way that racism plays into how wigs are prepared and fitted and created for women, with Black women, with natural hair. And we're already we see a Caden Kearney being cast as Emma in the national tour of the prom, and Caden is an actor who's non-binary. We see, shout out to Caden, their tour begins, I think, the 2nd of November, so that's coming up soon, and that show is going to make such a difference to people in the middle of the country. I'm so thrilled. We see Alexandra Billings. We see a show like Head Over Heels, where gender queerness is represented, and we see an actress like Peppermint, on stage. We see the national tour of that really incredible production of Oklahoma. We see Sis playing Ado Annie, right? And so sometimes, a lot of the times, the casting, it brings, a casting of an actor who's trans brings a different angle to the role, but it also has nothing, in terms of the lens that you can see it through, or the perspective that's brought to the role, and it has nothing to do with it at the same time, right? So Sis, being a trans woman and a Black trans woman, being Ado Annie, is just her being a woman, this character, right?
Yes.
She's just being Ado Annie. Now she's going to bring her own experiences, her own life experiences to that role, and bring something fresh to it. But she's, Alexandra Billings being Madame Morrible is just her playing this this campy woman who's, kind of working against our protagonists. So that, we just all want to be seen as people. Everybody just wants to be seen, right? We just want to be seen for our fullness, and our humanity. And so this, while we talk about representation, and so for example, if a character is non-binary, that character be played by an actor who's non-binary, because they can bring that experience to the role, and to the truth of performing that role. it's also not the only way we want to see people who are non-binary represented on stage at all, right?
Yes.
I'm not just
Yes.
my gender identity. And so we should not be asking that of other people.
Well, and I do wonder, I agree with you. I think in
Mm.
Broadway, we're going to see the casting decisions change before we see
Mm,
the stories change.
yeah.
I do kind of wonder regionally if
Mm,
we'll see a reversal in that. I think regionally we could see the stories change maybe before, or well, simultaneously or in tandem to seeing the casting change. So
true.
I
Yeah.
I I'm excited to see what happens on our regional stages,
Yeah.
and what work is born out of these conversations. But we just
Yeah.
want more representation.
Yeah.
Representation is important. People want to see themselves on stage, and like you
Yeah.
said, people want to be seen. Um,
Yeah. And I want to see different representations. I don't want to just
yes,
see theater through a white gaze. I don't want to just see that. It's limiting. It's most important. It's limiting to people in those marginalized groups, but it's limiting to us in the audience. In addition, we're
yes,
limiting ourselves to this white male cisgender able-bodied perspective. So Ado Annie is another, the Broadway production's another example of how representation matters, right? So here was the wonderful Ali Stroker playing Ado Annie in the Broadway production. She is a person who uses a wheelchair. And so she was just Ado Annie. She was just Ado Annie. But we got to see somebody who uses a wheelchair being sexy. And when do we see that
yes,
represented in the media? So she brought something that was fresh, to that role, and to our understanding of how we see somebody who uses a wheelchair. And she talked about also that people were given permission to stare, right? So it out in the street, it's rude to stare, but people's eyes see something different, and so they look. It's human nature. But now we're given permission to like see and to stare and to see. Oh, she uses a wheelchair and she's damn sexy. Oh, she uses a wheelchair and she's dancing. Oh, she uses a wheelchair and she's
yes.
in control.
And she's fierce. I mean, the way she devoured that role, it was hard to imagine anybody else being Ado Annie in that role. Although
Loved her
I'm
in that. Yeah.
so excited to see Sis. It
Yeah.
actually, I don't love that, but I am excited to see the show when it comes to Deepak and when it goes on tour to
Mhm.
see Sis in that role, because
I
that'll bring
don't
a
love
whole
that
different
show.
perspective.
Right. I don't love that show. I do love this production. And you either hate it or you love it, I think. I love a production that is surprising, not just to be surprising, not just to like shock value, but it made me think. And it didn't like I there were some things I was like, oh, that didn't quite work for me. That's okay. Like they reached, and I love that.
Well,
And not
and I
coincidentally, sorry, go ahead.
yeah, no, no, no. Keep going. Not
Oh, just not
coincidentally.
coincidentally. So the lead producer on Jagged Little Pill is a woman named Eva Price, who's a queer woman, um, who was also a lead producer on Oklahoma. So she has been part of these conversations about representation on stage, and then her production of Oklahoma has now cast a trans woman, in the role of Ado Annie in the national tour, and I'm sure that's not disconnected, right? So the conversations happening matter, like in this very direct way. We see Eva, being part of making this choice to cast Sis. No, Sis is talented. So it's not like the idea of tokenism is not like we'll just give somebody a chance because all these other white cisgender people are so talented, but we'll just let her have a chance. No, it's about getting in the room. It's about being seen. It's about connections, right?
Well, and it's about bringing people to the table who
Mm.
represent a variety of different voices so that you can open up these conversations.
Hmm.
Um, I think a lot of the conversation around jagged little pill, and I'm going to turn the spotlight to Hamilton for a second because Suni Reed from Hamilton, who is a trans actor, came out and talked about how they were treated on the national tour when they asked for gender neutral dressing rooms. All of this speaks to this idea of creating a safe space. And this terminology, safe space, which I'm not sure is the correct terminology. I've heard other people use affinity spaces and different language around this, but this idea is something that we've heard a lot during this reckoning. So if there's a theater producer out there, or there are creative teams out there watching this, how do we actually create a safe or affinity space or environment for our artists? And do we call it a safe space, or is there some other terminology we should be using?
I like affinity space. That's beautiful. I feel like safe space has been one of those terms that's been hijacked by the culture, by the kind of the social media culture to mean something a little different. It's like a place that's devoid of basically just sensory input, like, oh, you just need a padded room. And I think the original intention of that term was a place that is protected from real harm. Just like the term, like trigger warning has been hijacked as well. So, I think, again, it's complicated, right? But ideally, I know, budgets are always limited and all of that. Ideally, you start from the top and you hire, and you also, so start from the top. So we have our pronouns in here as, as cis allies, and I have my pronouns in my professional email signature. Anytime I'm doing, I'm doing anything, that's public facing, so that it's easier. It's easier for people who may be trans or non-binary, genderqueer, to have their pronouns in. So it's not automatically outing people as under the trans umbrella, right? So that just a simple act like that, and you said you're trying to be more cognizant of it. That's change. That's change. And and it starts at home. We make the change in our workplaces, or our place of work, our house, our business, our circles. So I think little things like that absolutely matter. Normalizing having people introduce themselves with their pronouns, on the first day of school. Communicating with people about what they need, and possibly hiring consultants to make spaces have affinity. We don't know what we don't know. So like me as a black woman, oh my God, as a white woman, I don't know the ins and outs of having, natural hair. So if I was a wig supervisor, I am definitely going to step in it. If I just don't know what I don't know. I'm not saying it's still on me to educate myself, but I'm saying equip people to support the team in a way that is in affinity with who they are. And I think the last part of it is hiring more diversely. So, part of the problem with Hamilton, which, kind of has the cloud of being like the most diverse show, the most kind of forward show on Broadway. And it's wonderful. I mean, it was iconoclastic. It broke glass ceilings. The creative team, it's been pointed out, the creative team are all white passing. And then behind the stage, it's mostly white, cis, able-bodied folks. So here you have, on stage, all these beautiful Black and brown folks, and Asian and AAPI. And then behind the stage, you know, these, for example, these white stage managers. So a non-binary person or a trans person, an identified trans person who identifies as trans says, I need a different changing room. Neither of these options fit my gender identity. And it's not properly accommodated. And that goes back to all of those parts of the issue. Hamilton, it's so easy to list our pronouns. Like every playbill could have pronouns in the actors' bios and the creative team's bios.
Yes.
Not that hard.
Well, and that's what I was going to ask you. Are we going to normalize that? Are we going to see that?
Please.
And that, listen, really, all of our regional theaters are now doing digital programs. It's easy. Just go into your digital file and change it.
Right. Because we're not even talking about, like, you know, cost per word now, right? For printing.
Yes.
Yeah. And, you know, you're seeing, you know, institutions, my local regional theater is the American Repertory Theater, and all of the people who work there have their pronouns in their email signatures, which is great. Right. Now let's get them in the programs. You know, and the change, I'll tell you, the change that we're seeing is not always coming from the top down. It is sometimes the people who don't have as much power as the people at the top who are demanding the change. And let's not forget that's what allyship is. That's using our privilege to create change and use our voice along with people who are marginalized.
Absolutely. And that kind of leads into this next discussion, because I feel like we would be remiss if we didn't talk about Dave Chappelle and his Netflix and his Netflix special. It's so interesting to me to watch the conversation on social media around this. And I'm not talking about, I'm talking about the people on my, and I'm going to use air quotes, friends list who follow Beltline to Broadway. And I've seen discourse with them. And these are people who really identify as Team Non-Turf, allies, friends. And I see them trying to make sense of Dave Chappelle's special and understand what they're seeing and why it's so hurtful and harmful for people. But the more they try to do that on social media, the more they're stepping into it. They're making the things worse for themselves, because and I'm not sure that social media is the place to try to work this out for yourself in the comments area, in the comments section, because I'm seeing things just spiral out of control. So on the one hand, people will say that Dave Chappelle is holding up a mirror to society and punching up his comedy. On the other hand, many in the trans community and those who consider themselves allies and sisters and brothers to the trans community feel that he is really causing harm. Does this kind of comedy go too far, or is it an opportunity for us to have a discourse around these topics?
Yeah. So I will say that my caveat here is that I haven't watched it. I've made a choice not to watch it. I loved the Chappelle show. I do like him, you know, historically as a comedian. But for me, I have heard from people in the trans community about the harm that this comedy special caused. So I've made a choice not to kind of use my dollars, so to speak, to watch that special. So I'm speaking from a place of being only partially informed. I've read a bunch about it, about this particular special. And I think, you know, I think the discourse goes back to the issue of harm, right? So you started, you know, you introduced our conversation in the context of real world harm that happens to trans people, especially trans women of color, are at a higher rate for domestic violence and homicide, being the victims of homicide. So when people, make this argument that there's not real world harm, it's a fallacy. The representations in media, which another Netflix special or program, Disclosure, the documentary Disclosure, that they streamed, they didn't produce it, pointed out very clearly and eloquently, there is a connection between how people are represented in media and real world harm. Watch Disclosure, watch the documentary. That's kind of the most synthesis I can give to it in this moment. But it's, in addition to, more extreme outcomes like homicide, there's also higher rates of, especially in teens, multiply higher rates of suicide attempts, lethality of suicide attempts, depression in the trans youth community, in trans youth population as compared to their cis peers. So I almost don't get that idea of like there's not real world harm. Like it's right there in the statistics, and that's always what I go to is, at the end of the day, like, professionally, I'm a scientist. So what's the science? At the end of the day, I'm also a humanitarian. So this supporting the trans community, with, just across the board, and with this, with what I'm hearing them saying about what harms this caused, who am I to tell them it didn't hurt them? People said it hurt them. That's enough. End of sentence. Right?
Yes.
So I do understand from what I've read that Dave Chappelle was trying, here's where it's complicated, was trying to make a point about white queerness excluding being anti-racist in their demands for change, which is true. It's historically true. It's currently true. Especially, well, there's white gay men who have just not done enough to fight racism, and there are a lot of white lesbians who are TERFs, trans exclusionary radical feminists. So that's a valid point, which you can make without punching down at the most marginalized, which are trans women of color. The most marginalized, and just everybody under the trans umbrella, right? But right there in particular, if your anti-racism doesn't include trans women of color, is it anti-racism? If your feminism doesn't include trans women, is it feminism? For me, the answer in both cases is no.
I totally agree. And I love, if anybody, if there's any takeaway from this conversation, because there's so much to unpack in all of these issues, is the idea of real world harm with a lot of these things, and a lot of the conversation. It's not even these things, it's the conversation happening around these things, because a show like Jagged Little Pill, clearly they've got an action plan, they're doing the work, they're making movement, there's movement there. So it's not really them, but it's a lot of the conversation happening around that, especially from people who may not either acknowledge or know what is happening with the show, with that particular show. Everything we're talking about, I feel like, just comes down to normalizing respect for our fellow humans, which really, you have children, I have children. We're, as moms, we're trying to teach our kids this. It doesn't seem like we should try to teach the world this, but apparently normalizing respect is something we need to teach people, or model for people. I find myself, whenever I'm trying to understand something that's outside my microcosm, and I'm going to just say microcosm, that I try to approach it from a place of curiosity. And I don't always get it right. but I feel like when you have that open heart and you're approaching it with from a place of curiosity, that becomes clear to the people that you're talking to. So if you're starting to ask the questions, to come to a place of understanding, I don't want to say you get a pass for being stupid, but a lot of times I will preface my conversations with, I really don't know. I'm not trying to be disrespectful. I'm trying to understand. Are there questions people can ask, should be asking as they're trying to get more information and understand these issues without causing more harm and hurt? Because that's what
Mhm.
I'm seeing on social media. I think there are people on social media, in my friend group particularly, who are really trying to understand these issues, and they're not trying to cause more harm and hurt. But they don't seem to be starting with the right questions, starting with the
Mm.
right verbiage. So, where can we start these conversations so that people understand where our hearts are and where we're coming from?
Yeah. I, my mind's going a few different places. One is that I think you can say that, you can start any conversation with, I want to be a better active ally. So I want to understand better. Um, Come from a place of solidarity, not of a place of questioning to make somebody validate what their
Mhm.
experience is. I want to put a caveat in that uh, never, don't, please, 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 never ask somebody about their body parts. And this seems to it happens so much to people who are trans. None of our business. Do you go up to somebody else and ask them about their private parts? Like, don't do it. So just don't ask. Just don't ask. Um, and I think also respect people's boundaries in terms of, do you have the bandwidth to answer a couple of questions? And if they don't, then respect that. And also do the work to try to educate yourself, because we live in an internet age. There's so much that's available to us, at the tips of our fingers. So do your work, do your research, find reputable resources and read up. Um, in regards to Tootsie, for example, there's a great piece by the theater educator and theater critic Christian Lewis, who it happens to be non-binary, who wrote a fantastic piece about the trouble with Tootsie. You can read all about it, and it will help people understand. So I think, doing your own research, and then also just respecting that, that for somebody who belongs to, a marginalized group in our society, that it's daily attacks, daily harm, big and small, right? Micro and macro aggressions. And so somebody might not have the bandwidth to answer your questions. And so, asking somebody if they do first shows so much value and respect for their humanity.
Mhm. I love that. I love that. And that's what it is. Seeing people, and respecting people and having value in our fellow humans shouldn't be a big thing, but apparently it is. So
Yeah.
I am so appreciative to you for joining me this morning and having this conversation. Again, I feel like we just scratched the surface. Um, and I feel like there's just so many layers to
Mhm.
this conversation. As I mentioned at the beginning, on November 2nd, we're going to be continuing this conversation with Heather Strickland, Patrick Torres, and Candace Cox. We'll be doing a live chat. Patrick and Heather are with Raleigh Little Theater, and they've been doing a lot of work around their production of Cinderella. So we'll be talking about some of the action plans they've taken with regards to Cinderella. So tune in for that. If you've come in late to this conversation, this will replay and be available to stream on our Facebook and YouTube pages. It'll be available on the website. I'll be extracting the audio. It'll be available on the podcast. So I want to make it as accessible to you. And when I repost it, I will repost with the links and the resources that we've discussed. And just keep the conversation going, because I think these conversations are important. So thank you, Alisa, for being here. Have a wonderful, I know you're heading to New York to see more shows. I'm jealous, and I will be watching vicariously to see
Yes.
you. And thank you all for watching today. And let's just keep talking. Alisa, you're still you have your Brain Lab and your musicals and mental health series. Do you want to talk about that so people can find out more about the work you're doing with regards to theater and these topics?
Yeah, musicals. The Instagram series "Musicals and Mental Health" was kind of a pandemic project, and now that I'm back in my office, I kind of don't have the time. It's kind of a substitute for my commute time. But they're almost all the episodes are on my IGTV at thedrdrama.com. So THEDRDRAMA, and there are people on there like. I was blessed to have some incredible people on there. Ali Stroker, Celia Rose Gooding, and gosh, and now I'm blanking on everybody. Brittany Mack from Six.
So many people.
So many people. I mean, if you've seen them on stage, they're probably on there. And then currently running a series with actor Kaylin West, who is playing Alyssa Green in the national tour of the prom. A series called Brain Lab, which is kind of conceptualized as an accessible conversation around everyday mental health things. So everything from the personal cost of resentment to how to best be an ally, to what does it mean for theater to be back, and how do we feel about that? Just really like figuring out this thing we call life. And so that's usually we run that on Thursdays, sometime early evening. Right now she's in tech, so we're holding that until the show gets up and running, so she can concentrate on that. And then I'll have some more appearances coming up. Theater Symposium. Oh God, I forget the name of this. The Theater Makers Summit. November 7th.
Yes.
Yeah. I'll be.
I saw that on social media too.
Yeah,
and hopefully Broadway Con for people. I know people are starting to talk about
Broadway
Con. Hopefully Broadway Con.
Yeah, I should be there again. Yes.
And again, I'll put the link to your website and your social media handles, so people can find you and follow you and see all the great work you're doing. And I can't wait to see you in person and hug your neck again. You give good hugs.
You do too. Thank you for inviting me on and making space for this conversation. I just always selfishly enjoy talking with you. So, but then also to be able to talk about something that I think is very important conversation to be having. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you, and safe travels today as you travel into the city, and thank you all for watching. And I follow Dr. Drama, follow the Dr. Drama on social media. And thank you all, and we will talk again soon.